Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Marlene Meyerson JCC Manhattan in virtual Zoom land. I'm Rabbi Joy Levitt, and I'm the JCC's Chief Executive Officer. Thank you so much for joining us for this important conversation, co-sponsored by the incredible list of congregations and organizations you saw listed on the opening slide, and organized by the JCC's Joseph Stern Center for Social Responsibility, which is dedicated to educating, inspiring, and empowering people to work for a better and fairer world. I'm particularly happy to be with you tonight in light of the last 24 hours. Yesterday, we witnessed an unprecedented attack on our democracy as insurrectionists stormed the United States Capitol building. It was terrifying, and in my opinion, one of the lowest moments, if not the lowest moment in the history of our democracy. However, we should not be surprised. We can link these acts of hate to other moments in our country's recent past, including those of the 2017 Unite the Right rally, when neo-Nazis and white supremacists descended on Charlottesville, Virginia, for a weekend of violence. Integrity First for America, in partnership with a world-class legal team, is uniquely taking on individuals and hate groups at the center of this violent movement, holding them accountable in federal court for the violence that they brought to Charlottesville in 2017. Tonight, we will hear from Integrity First for America's Executive Director, Amy Spitalnik, and lead attorney, Roberta Kaplan, who will discuss this landmark lawsuit and the fight against violent hate in the year ahead, from the courts to the White House, as they engage in conversation with the amazing Jamie Floyd, who is the senior editor for Race and Justice Unit at New York Public Radio. Jamie is also the legal editor in the WNYC newsroom. In a journalism career that has spanned 2 decades, Jamie has worked on everything, including Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Jamie still considers her interview with Myrlie Evers Williams, widow of the slain civil rights leader Medgar Evers, to be her most meaningful. Until September 2020, Jamie served as the weekday host of All Things Considered. There will be time for questions from the audience tonight, so please feel free to submit yours at any point during the conversation by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Finally, I want to invite you to join us tomorrow at 3 p.m. for a virtual gathering, We the People, an Interfaith Vigil for Democracy. We will hear from Representatives Jerry Nadler and Representative Jones and Mandy Patinkin, and leaders from our city's rich faith communities. Information can be found on the JCC's website. Maybe we'll also be able to put it in the chat and on social media outlooks. And now please join me in welcoming Jamie, Roberta, and Amy.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Levitt, Joy, for that introduction. And I apologize for my somber tone, but I think it's appropriate. I share Joy's great concern for our democracy, which is ever has been, but is at this moment so very fragile. And I think that you were prescient in scheduling this event for tonight after the tragic assault on our democracy yesterday by white supremacist supporters of President Trump. Of course, in watching the trajectory of our country and culture over the course of the last 4 years, and as noted, with extremism at record levels, perhaps the foresight was less notable than we would have hoped it to be. We are so fortunate to have 2 women who spend their professional lives tracking hate and fighting white supremacy in the courts, joining us in reflection and hopefully forward thinking for tonight's conversation. Roberta Kaplan and Amy Svetelnik. Robbie Kaplan is the founding partner of Kaplan, Hecker, and Fink. Among other accolades, Robbie has been selected as one of the 100 most influential lawyers in the United States, as litigator of the year, as lawyer of the year, and as most innovative lawyer of the year. In 2013, her landmark victory in United States versus Windsor brought down the Defense of Marriage Act, landing the first major legal victory in the battle for marriage equality. And Robbie is also the co-founder of the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund and an adjunct professor of law at Columbia Law School. Robbie, thank you so much for being with us tonight. And of course, Amy Svetelnik is well known to, I think, everyone on this call. She is the executive director of Integrity First for America, the nonpartisan civil rights nonprofit that is backing the landmark federal lawsuit filed by the Coalition of Charlottesville community members against the neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and hate groups responsible for the violence that Joy alluded to. We all remember it too well, from August 2017. And Amy came to IFA with extensive experience in government, politics, and advocacy, including as the communications director and senior policy advisor to the New York Attorney General's office. And she'd also served as the communications advisor and spokesperson for the New York City mayor and communications director in the New York State Senate. Amy, thank you as well for joining us. And I guess, Amy, I'll start with you by asking you to take us back to 2017. So many news events have transpired, so much has happened. Remind us about Charlottesville. What happened there, and how did this case come about?
Thank you so much, Jamie, and to the JCC and all of the sponsors who made tonight possible. As you said, I don't think we could have expected just how timely this would be when we scheduled it. But as you also said, I think this is just an issue that is sadly not going to go away and will be quite timely for some time. So really, thank you to everyone involved for making this a focus. Before we dive into the case and what happened, we're going to show a brief 2-minute video that will bring us back to Charlottesville 2 years ago. The team at the JCC will play it in a moment, and I do want to warn folks that it is a bit disturbing. Given what we're talking about here, there are some violent images and sounds, and we like to make sure people know that before we hit play. And then once we watch the brief video, we'll dive into what exactly happened and how this case came about.
Terror in Charlottesville. Stark displays of racism.
Trying to promote a car has rammed into a crowd.
Victims thrown in the air.
Deadly act of domestic terror.
One woman dead, others critically wounded.
10 of the people who were injured in Charlottesville, including 3 of the people who were hit by that car and survived, have now brought a lawsuit against not only the murderer who drove his vehicle into the crowd, but also the leaders of all of the white nationalist groups that organized and promoted the Charlottesville event.
We are Integrity First for America. We are here to disrupt the extremism, to interrupt the cycle, to dismantle and bankrupt these hate groups and their leaders, to put them out of business, and most importantly, to stop the violence. Integrity First for America is leading the fight against white supremacy. Our Charlottesville lawsuit is the only current legal effort taking on the broad leadership of this movement, holding white supremacists accountable for their premeditated violence. We know that it's working. They're already facing huge financial and legal consequences. But we also know what we're up against. Bankrupting Nazis isn't cheap. These groups are still recruiting, weaponizing fear, and preparing for their next attack. Now more than ever, we are reminded of our obligation to dismantle the systems of white supremacy that poison this country. Turn your outrage into action, because hate has no place here.
I always like to encourage people to take a breath, perhaps, after seeing that. And I think particularly after seeing that and probably watching the news for the last 24 hours or so. So it's not an easy topic, and I really am grateful to all of you for being here tonight to talk about it. I'll spend a little bit of time reminding folks exactly what happened in Charlottesville, and then I'll pass it to Robbie to talk about the genesis of this case. It feels like several lifetimes ago. And what really struck me in watching that video for the first time since the events of yesterday is really just how you can draw a straight line from what happened yesterday to Charlottesville in terms of the tools, the tactics, the players, the ideology that we saw. And I know we're going to dive into this over the course of our conversation, but it's important to remember what happened 3.5 years ago. First, on the evening of Friday, August 11th, these white supremacists and neo-Nazis descended on the University of Virginia, chanting things like "Jews will not replace us," "blood and soil," carrying tiki torches, which were specifically meant to evoke the KKK and the Nazis. And at the campus during this march that was intentionally constructed as a surprise. They had not announced it in advance publicly, and it was intended to surprise the UVA community. They surrounded a small group of small counter-protesters who had gathered at the Thomas Jefferson statue. They ultimately kicked them, punched them, threw fuel and torches at them, beat them up. One of our plaintiffs who was there that evening, a UVA undergrad who's an African-American man, said he thought he was going to die. And of course, the violence continued where a nearby interfaith gathering hosted by another one of our plaintiffs, a reverend, had to shelter in place. The violence, of course, only continued throughout the weekend. I think we all know how August 12th culminated with the car attack, which I'll speak to in a second, but it's important to understand that that was really the culmination of a day of violence. Under the guise of protesting the removal of these Confederate statues, these extremists marched on downtown Charlottesville. It was a Saturday, so it was a Shabbat morning, and the synagogue was observing services. And while they had tried to account for the fact that there would be extremists in their community, no matter how much they moved Shabbat services, they still became a target of these extremists who ultimately surrounded the synagogue. They had talked about, quote, torching those Jewish monsters in their social media chats. They chanted Sieg Heil while carrying semi-automatic weapons. The synagogue had to be evacuated. The Torah scrolls were evacuated. The detail that gets me every single time, no matter how often I hear it, is that the synagogue was home to a scroll that had been saved from Nazi Germany decades ago. And here in America, decades later, it was once again under Nazi threat. And that detail, for me, it gets me every single time. The violence continued throughout the day. They charged a line of interfaith clergy, including our plaintiff, Reverend Wispelway. And ultimately, James Fields drove his car into a crowd of peaceful counter-protesters who were headed home for the day, killing Heather Heyer, injuring many others, including many of our plaintiffs, many of whom you can see in the iconic Pulitzer-winning photo of the car hitting the crowd that you saw in that video just now, including Marcus Martin, who's splayed across the back of the car, and a variety of others. And what's so important to understand, not just about what happened in Charlottesville, but frankly also about what happened yesterday, is that this violence was planned meticulously in advance in social media chats, down to every last detail, including discussions of whether they would hit protesters with cars and then claim self-defense, which is, of course, precisely what they did. And this is a tool and a tactic that we've seen over and over again, as I said, including yesterday. And so with this clear evidence in mind that Robbie can talk about in a moment, it really created the impetus for our plaintiffs to take action and hold those accountable for the racist violent conspiracy that happened in Charlottesville 3.5 years ago. So I'll pass it to Robbie to share how the case itself came about and the legal theory.
So I'm just going to tell the story as it happened. Basically, I started my current law firm in July of 2017, July 1, but we only moved into our new offices on August 7th. I think our lease began. And that next week was really our first week in the office, which was also the first week after Charlottesville. On August 14th was that Monday. And we only had a few employees at that point, and we were kind of working on folding chairs and card tables. But I decided, since I wanted us to be dedicated to doing work in the public interest, that we would watch over lunch the news coverage of what had happened. As people may recall, that's when our soon-to-be former president gave his speech about there are very fine people on both sides. And watching that coverage and watching Trump's press conference, I think I was so horrified, as were my colleagues, that we decided that something needed to be done about it. And we were rightly very concerned that then Attorney General Jeff Sessions, given his background from Alabama, was not going to be particularly motivated to do that. So we thought that we would take it on ourselves. Within about 48 hours or 72 hours of that, I was on a plane down to Charlottesville with the help of my friend Dahlia Lithwick, who had lived there for a couple of decades before that. We met with folks. It's fair to say that the town was very much still in a state of shock. And the white vans that many of the white nationalists and Nazis had used to kind of come into Charlottesville, they were these white Mercedes vans. They were still driving on the streets, particularly in the African-American neighborhoods. So people were rightly terrified. Many of those people, including Reverend Seth, who Amy mentioned, became our clients and plaintiffs in the case. And then we got a couple of lucky breaks. Lucky break one was the fact that some group or someone managed to get into the servers contained on a website, which was previously a gamer website called Discord, that had been used by the leaders of the Charlottesville conspiracy to plan it, as Amy mentioned, for weeks and months leading up to it. And they were so meticulous about it, they had different server groups depending upon what you were interested in. So they had leadership channel, uniform channel, weapons channel. And in order to participate in those conversations, you had to be admitted by one of two people, a guy by the name of Jason Kessler or a guy by the name of Elliot Klein. And many of those, as I said, were hacked into, and we kind of were able to read them ourselves. And so we used those chats, essentially, to figure out who was responsible, who was doing what, who was the leadership. And then we had to find what legal structure to use. And unfortunately, we had to go, since there are no domestic terrorism statutes in the United States yet, we had to go back to a statute passed in 1871, the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, that was passed in order to implement the 13th Amendment, which is the amendment prohibiting slavery, believe it or not. But it prohibits conspiracies to commit racially motivated violence. It hasn't been used all that often in US history, for the most part because it hasn't been needed. It was used obviously when it was passed during Reconstruction, when the KKK was on the rise in the South and when Jim Crow was starting. It was used in the 20s when there were a lot of racial riots in the 1920s. And it was used most recently in the last big civil rights movement, particularly with cases of people who were crossing state lines and were killed in Mississippi and other places, and their parents sued under the KKK Act of 1871 successfully. We decided to use it here, and we put all these chats together with the law together, and brought a complaint a long time ago now, in October 2017, charging almost 24 individuals and entities who were the leaders of this conspiracy for planning violence based on hate in Charlottesville, and then committing that violence and then celebrating how successful their plot had been, all of which they did. Since that time, we've been engaged diligently in getting discovery. We had a good portion, as I said before, of their communications when we brought the complaint, but now we have all their communications. That took a lot of work and a lot of patience and a lot of sanctions motions and sanction orders from the judge. But we're there, and we honestly would have already tried the case. We were going to start it the week before the presidential election, but COVID obviously put a big wrench in those plans. And because the judge is a senior status and I think he's in his 80s, we're not going to take the chance of trying it until the next fall because we definitely want a jury. This should be a jury case and a jury trial. So we're going to have a jury trial in October in Charlottesville, Virginia.
So Robbie, I was going to ask you about the procedural posture of the case. You've pretty much laid it out. It sounds as though you want to stick with this judge and you want a jury trial, and COVID has pretty much put a big hurdle in those plans, but you're proceeding as much apace as you can.
Correct. And each time we had these delays, we went back to our plaintiffs, of course, and we said, and they're frustrated by it, but we said, do you still want to do this? Do you still want a jury trial? And to a person, each of them said, we want this tried before a jury. I agree with that. The citizens of Charlottesville should decide who did what and who's responsible for what in connection with those horrendous events. And that's what will happen. And it's going to be quite a trial because there's, again, a lot of defendants who will show up, many of them without lawyers, which makes it a little trickier because they tend to be pretty kind of out of control, like we've seen very recently. So it's going to be quite a spectacle.
Which takes me to my next question, and either of you or both of you can take it. Who are these defendants? And I guess I will also ask what motivates them to the extent we know or can know. Who are they?
Start, Amy, and I'll fill in.
So the defendants truly are a who's who of the violent white nationalist and white supremacist movement in America. And some of these are household names to the extent that that's possible. And others are names you might not know of, but who have played a central role in this violence. Folks like Richard Spencer, who I'm sure many people watching know. People like Andrew Anglin, who runs the hate site, The Daily Stormer, which is the country's leading neo-Nazi site, and coincidentally was probably chief cheerleader of yesterday's events, going all the way back to last fall when he took President Trump's stand back, stand by comments as a direct call for a civil war, and has been cheerleading the attack on Washington ever since. A number of others, including the two people Robbie mentioned earlier, Jason Kessler and Elliot Klein, who were two of the lead organizers. Jason Kessler, of course, was a Proud Boy. And then a number of hate groups like the League of the South, which is a neo-Confederate group, the National Socialist Movement, which is the country's largest neo-Nazi group, Vanguard America, Identity Europa. And these are all groups and individuals that have not just been responsible for what happened in Charlottesville. And as I said, and I'm sure we'll dive into, have these connections to what happened yesterday in certain ways, but also are really at the center of this broader movement with deep connections to the cycle of violence we've seen since Charlottesville. We know that some of the Charlottesville leaders communicated with the Pittsburgh shooter before his attack on the Tree of Life congregation in October of 2018. The Christchurch shooter, who killed dozens of Muslims praying in mosque 2 years ago, not only donated to some of our defendants, but also painted onto his gun a white power symbol that was popularized by one of our defendants. You could see directly just how influenced he was by them. And of course, that attack in turn inspired the Poway attack and the El Paso attack just 2 years ago at this point. And so we see that they're central to the cycle of violence, and we believe that we can have a really direct, tangible impact on them by going after their finances, going after their operations, because it's not just about what happened in Charlottesville, because of their centrality to this broader movement. Now, what motivates them is hate and white supremacy. It is crystal clear, and I think it's so important to understand that this white supremacy isn't limited to the groups that we know as white supremacist groups, the groups that wear a swastika or explicitly identify as Klansmen or something along those lines. This is a white supremacy that has really pervaded the entire far right, from groups that might not explicitly identify as white supremacists and use this euphemistic language like nationalism or Western chauvinism or different things along those lines. But at the end of the day, they are motivated by a white supremacy to which both racism and frankly anti-Semitism is at its very core. And specifically, they're motivated by something called replacement theory, which is the ideology behind the chant of Jews will not replace us. It's the ideology that fueled so many of the other white supremacist attacks that I mentioned. This idea that the country is being stolen from white people. And this idea of a steal is something that we keep hearing over and over again, as one of our colleagues pointed out earlier today to Robbie and I. These far-right extremists believe that everything is being stolen from them. The election, the country, their power as white men so often. And so it's really that motivates them, this idea that the white race is being replaced by Jews, sort of by people of color, by minorities and others, controlled by Jews often. And that is the same sort of heinous replacement theory that fueled not just what happened in Charlottesville, but so many of the subsequent attacks, and really ties into this broader far-right ideology that has become so pervasive in recent years.
Let me add that, I really only truly understood the phrase intersectional when I started working on this case. And the reason is because these people, these defendants, and again, the people who stormed the Capitol yesterday, are truly intersectional in their hatreds. They hate African Americans. They hate immigrants. They hate Muslims. They're not particularly crazy about gay people. But the one thing I have to say, and it's kind of hard to shock me, given what I do for a living, but the one thing in this case that truly did shock me is when we started reading their communications, including the ones that we got pursuant to our discovery program, by subpoena, et cetera, is that I would say of the statements that they make, their motivating statements about who they hate and why they're doing what they're doing, the vast majority of it is focused on Jews. And the reason I was so surprised by that is I have to assume most of these men, they're all men in our case, came from outside of Charlottesville. Most of them live in rural areas. I have to assume that most of them don't know a lot of Jews in their day-to-day life. But when you read what they say, they are absolutely focused on, as Amy put it, this hatred of the Jews because somehow all these other things they don't like, civil rights for African Americans, people being able to immigrate into the United States, all of that is supposedly the fault of the Jews. We're the master puppeteer. I'm obviously Jewish given my name, but we're the master puppeteer who controls all the rest of this. Again, hearkening back to anti-Semitic philosophy and anti-Semitic ideas that existed, in Europe prior to the Nazis. And it's truly shocking. So anyone who's naive enough to think, including the people yesterday at the Capitol, that this isn't about me, this is about Black Lives Matter, or this is about, people coming across the Mexican border, as I just said, that would be extremely naive. Because if you're Jewish, I'm telling you, it's about you too, and they see you as enemy number one.
Well, I have to say, Robbie, I actually see some hopefulness in that because there are more of us together. As Franklin said, we can surely hang together, right? I won't say the second half of the phrase, right? But I want to ask a question about Barack Obama. Because I wonder, and of course we can't get inside the minds of these intersectional haters, but you're doing a pretty good job of it. How much of this is a backlash to the power that a Black man had for 8 years? How much of it is a reaction to the inability to accept that a Black man or an African man of African descent, if you will, however they want to define him. He defined himself as an African American who had a white mother. That may also make them very angry. How much of it is about that and the fact that a woman almost took his place in that office and actually won the popular vote by 3 million? Is that fueling a lot of this anger to the extent that we know? I mean, this may be more a question for the Southern Poverty Law Center and their hate map. But can you speak to that at all?
No, there's no question. The short answer is yes. All of it's fueling it. They feel that Barack Obama and his administration and the idea that Hillary Clinton had the audacity to run for president in her program, and now Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, that all these people, as you've heard Amy say, that they have taken away from them their rightful place at the top of American society. And because that has happened, aided again by the international Zionist Jewish conspiracy. And because that has happened, in their view, the only way to get back their place is to defeat and subjugate, really, and kill all those groups. Again, it's shocking the degree to which it feels like we're back in Germany in the 1930s, because their beliefs, as Deborah Lipstadt will testify, as our expert, one of our experts in this case, are not that different.
And I think you can really understand sort of how this idea that Jews are the puppet masters replacing the white race with everyone that they despise plays out, because it's not just, Jews orchestrating Barack Obama as president or Hillary Clinton's campaign. It's also this idea that, for example, of the caravan of immigrants and refugees coming up through our southern border, that of course there's no explanation for other than George Soros funding them. Or Black Lives Matter protests, that of course there's no explanation for other than Jews and George Soros funding them. And it's that same trope that might seem, again, sort of softer, not as egregiously white supremacist as the Jews will not replace us in blood and soil that we heard on the streets of Charlottesville. But it's that same white supremacist replacement theory just mainstreamed into far-right politics. And it's so important to understand that, to call it out when you see it, because it's all part of the same dynamic.
Well, and it certainly dovetails with the QAnon component of what is happening, and was present on the streets of Washington and on the in the building that is the Capitol yesterday. You started to talk, Robbie, in some detail about the plaintiffs, and as did you, Amy. But let's come back to the plaintiffs, because clearly they're courageous and should not be overlooked. Can you say a bit more about who your plaintiffs are? You mentioned the Reverend, but there are others.
So we have a group of people that really sadly kind of touch on the whole kaleidoscope of events that happened those 2 days. So we have a bunch of very brave students who were there on Friday night, who, as you've probably seen in the videos or the photos, who were surrounding the Thomas Jefferson statue at the Rotunda on the UVA campus, and who were surrounded by these neo-Nazis and white supremacists who were hurling fuel on them and trying to light them with the tiki torches. One of our plaintiffs was an African-American undergrad at UVA, and said he literally thought he was going to get killed that night. It's probably the most terrifying event, frankly, of the whole thing, because the car attack came out of nowhere, and this was just this planned, horrific incident. We have people who showed up on Saturday to protest, including Marcus and his then fiance Marissa, who were friends with Heather Heyer. Marissa and Heather Heyer worked together as paralegals at a law firm. And Marcus is the guy, the very large guy who's, as everyone's seen in the iconic photo, his body is being hurled over the car as James Fields is driving in, and he pushed Marissa away, saved her life by pushing her away just before it happened. We had several other people who were injured, hit by that car attack. We had people like the Reverend, who was part of the religious interfaith clergy who were there, and he's very famous for standing arm in arm with people like Cornel West and others, trying to hold the line on Saturday afternoon as lines and lines of armed neo-Nazis and KKK members kind of tried to breach their line. And that's basically the group, but it goes from students to community members to activists, all of whom were grievously injured in one way or the other by what happened to them that weekend. And what Marcus says is absolutely right. I mean, his whole leg was shattered, and he had to have surgery and all kinds of replacements in his leg and in his hip. But as he's put it so eloquently, that can be fixed. The psychic damage, the PTSD, the psychological damage and scars that they suffer will never be fixed.
I just want to say that I think our plaintiffs are the bravest people I know, because I can't imagine what they lived through. And the fact that instead of sort of taking an easy, as Robbie has described, this has not been a fast case, it's not been an easy case to be a plaintiff in. You have to re-traumatize yourself essentially every time you're deposed and engaged in some way. they've chosen to do this instead of taking an easy path because they want to win justice for their community. And they know that this case can be so impactful in not just holding accountable those responsible for what happened, but sending a deterrent to others, that there will be real consequences for this sort of behavior. And so I just think they're so incredibly brave for choosing this path as opposed to taking the easy route, which would have been so understandable. Oh, I think you're muted.
Are they, Amy, or IFA receiving threats, under threat, as they pursue this litigation?
This is the part of the event where I see if my mother is watching, because it is probably her and many of ours, of course, least favorite part of the job. An expected part of this work, but certainly not pleasant. As you could imagine, both the defendants in our case and their supporters are not thrilled that they are being held accountable. They're particularly not thrilled that they're being held accountable by an organization and a legal team led by Jewish women, which has been central to some of their threats and harassment. And so both we at IFA, Robbie certainly, and our team, the plaintiffs, receive an extraordinary amount of threats. In fact, while we were on this call, I think we got our daily threat report from our firm that keeps an eye on the dark web to see what the Nazis are saying about us today. I do not recommend reading that before bed. And it's always sort of a gamble when you open it up to see what today will hold. And so, to be completely honest, the biggest line item in IFA's budget is security for this reason. The legal work is generously being donated by world-class attorneys like Robbie and many others. It's our security that serves as the single biggest cost in this case, which is not an expense that exists in most civil litigation, because you're not dealing with neo-Nazi defendants who like to threaten the legal team, the organization, the plaintiffs. But the point of these threats is to deter us from holding them accountable. It's the point of all of this violence, whether it be what happened in Charlottesville, the threats against us, the violence at the Capitol yesterday. All of it is meant to deter people from exercising their fundamental rights and undermine our democracy. That's the entire point, whether it be threatening protesters like our plaintiffs, or threatening lawmakers as they go about our democratic process, or threatening us for using our justice system, rightfully so, to hold them accountable. And so we're not going to let them deter us no matter how much they threaten us. We are going to make sure that we have the resources in place to keep our teams safe, particularly when we're at trial, which is going to be a 4 to 6 week process in Charlottesville when the time comes this fall. And so we are going to make sure that we have every resource possible to keep our team and our plaintiffs safe, but we're not going to let them deter us from holding them accountable.
Which gets me to the next question. I want to ask you, Amy, and Robbie, please weigh in here. I want to ask you for an aerial view. Can you give us a sense of the landscape of white nationalism and these groups, extremist violence across the country?
Yes, let me start, and then Amy should finish. But look, one of the problems, there's a line in I think it's one of Moses' speeches before he dies in Deuteronomy, where he says that the Torah or the Bible is a blessing and a curse. And in this world, I would say the same thing about technology. Technology has enabled, obviously, us to live lives that were unimaginable 5, 10, 15 years ago. On the other hand, technology, specifically the internet, in this case, has allowed what in the 1920s were a bunch of guys in white hoods somewhere in the woods of Mississippi or Alabama to now communicate across the country, and indeed, as Amy, I'm sure will explain because she's an expert on this, across the world. And it's a real problem. I know it's in the headlines every day, but it is indeed a real problem. And even the sites that try to control it, even the more mainstream sites that try to control it, doesn't really control it because they just jump from site to site to whichever site will host them. And there's always someone out there who's willing to host them. So unfortunately, there's really no limit to anyone becoming involved in this. At the beginning of the case, I used to joke that the guys who did this, especially since they were on this gaming server called Discord, were probably guys who lived in their parents' basements playing video games, and somehow, seized on this idea of white supremacy and hatred and found it as a new rallying cry, and then came up out of their parents' basements onto the streets of Charlottesville with weapons. And our goal in this case is to send them back to their parents' basements where they belong. But it is a very difficult problem, not only in this case and for this country, but even for law enforcement, because technology allows communication and conspiracies and organization that were previously, unimaginable.
I 100% agree. And I think, I've been asked over the last however many hours it's been since the attack at the Capitol, 24:30, aren't you surprised by what happened? And I think anyone who is surprised by what happened yesterday hasn't been paying attention.
Right.
What happened yesterday is the inevitable culmination of years of disinformation, of conspiracy theories, of hateful white supremacist rhetoric, and outright incitement on social media, and among this sort of fractured but not so fractured far right that we saw ultimately manifest in the attack on the Capitol yesterday. And you can draw a straight line from that back to Charlottesville in terms of the tools, the tactics that they've used. And it's not just anecdotal. I think any of us looking at what has happened in this country in the last few years, even if we didn't know any of the numbers, would have to acknowledge that there's a major problem. Charlottesville, the Capitol, Pittsburgh, Poway, El Paso. But the stats back this up, unfortunately. The 2019 numbers, which are the most recent ones we have from law enforcement and experts, show that, for example, hate crimes hit record levels in 2019, that domestic terror has hit record levels. The Department of Homeland Security, in a report that the Trump administration tried to bury, but thankfully a whistleblower came forward with, found that white supremacist terror was the, quote, most persistent and lethal threat to our country. This was just a few months ago in the fall. And the ADL found that 2019 had record levels of anti-Semitic incidents, the highest level of anti-Semitic incidents since they started tracking. And so every indicator shows that we are grappling with record levels of hate, of violence, of extremism in this country. So much of it has been fueled by the sort of conspiracy theories and disinformation that we've been talking about here, whether it be something like replacement theory, whether it be the QAnon theory, which is rooted in fundamentally anti-Semitic and bigoted ideas of a Jewish global cabal controlling the world, and whether it be incitement and encouragement from the highest levels of our own government. And so you can't look at the landscape of white supremacy and white nationalism in this country and not understand that we really are grappling with what I think is the most dire threat to our national security right now. And my hope is that while, as Robbie described earlier, private plaintiffs and NGOs like us have provided sort of an outsized role during the last 4 years, because we had a federal government that not only was unwilling to engage here, but actively encouraging hate in many cases, and slashing programs meant to deal with it. In 2 weeks, we will have a new administration. And while our case can really have that outsized impact on the finances, the operations of these extremists, and having that deterrent effect that we've talked about, we can't do it alone. We need a broad, comprehensive effort that brings together federal, state, and local law enforcement and government, that encourages and pushes where necessary the private sector and tech companies to finally take action, whether it be the mainstream sites that have been sort of insufficient in their ability to deal with this, or the sites that have built entire business models on platforming extremism, where you need web hosting companies and domain registration companies to step in and cut them off. And the private sector writ large, in addition to NGOs like us and the many others working in this space. And so it's going to take a concerted effort. I'm confident that, particularly with some of the civil rights appointments that were announced today, we are moving in the right direction when it comes to the federal government, which is a big sigh of relief for many of us who have been working in this space. But this is not going to be easy. And it's so critical that we use every tool we have, including our justice system, to fight back and create real consequences, because that's the only way we're going to break this cycle that has been so persistent over the last few years.
Amy, thank you for that. And I see Cheryl has joined us because she is going to throw some questions to each of you from our audience. So Cheryl, we have a big audience and that means a lot of questions. So take it away.
That is absolutely true. Let's start with what parallels do you see between Charlottesville and yesterday's events?
Do you want me to start, Robbie, or do you want to?
Let me start and you can finish up. I mean, look, the parallels are stunning. They go from the actual people involved. One of the people involved yesterday was a guy whose moniker is Baked Alaska. He was also heavily involved in the planning that led up to Charlottesville. So the same groups, including the Proud Boys, who were prominent, as everyone knows, yesterday, and were prominent in Charlottesville. To the ideology, this kind of paranoid conspiracy ridden hatred of everything that an open society and equality under the law stands for. 2, 3, the techniques, the use of social media. I'm quite confident that when the facts are revealed, you're going to see a conspiracy about yesterday very similar to what we've been able to establish about Charlottesville, using the same techniques, the same kind of lying, the same joking about, oh, I didn't really mean to do this. It's all very typical of the way they do this. And again, finally, the blaming it on Antifa. This is their favorite rallying cry. In Charlottesville, what caused the violence, according to these guys, was Antifa, who were somehow there. They were really undergrads at UVA, who they had to be careful about because they were so armed and dangerous. They needed to defend themselves in Charlottesville. And you've heard the same thing about yesterday, again, with not a shred of evidence that there was anyone in any way associated with an organization called Antifa who were involved in counting the Electoral College votes at Congress. So it's part of the same pattern, the same people, the same tactics, and the same ideologies.
And in fact, to the last point that Robbie was making, some far-right pundits are using a photo of someone who was in the Capitol yesterday with one of our neo-Nazi defendants, Matthew Heimbach, as a means to claim that it was Antifa, because this photo they found on an Antifa website that was tracking neo-Nazis and didn't actually, or they probably recognize it, but this is meant to, of course, push out disinformation and distract from the fact that yesterday was a far-right attack. And so it really speaks to the attempts to deflect. I also just want to affirm what Robbie said about the ideology at play. While yesterday wasn't necessarily a white supremacist attack in the full-on traditional sense that Charlottesville was, they didn't go to defend a Confederate statue, and hypothetically it wasn't a white supremacist attack. Of course it was a white supremacist attack. And there are those who are trying to muddy the waters. But if you look at the imagery that was there was a guy in a Camp Auschwitz shirt. There was a noose hanging outside the Capitol. There were Confederate flags and other Nazi imagery. White supremacy is at the core of this far-right movement. And in some cases, it's explicit white supremacist groups that, have the Confederate logo or Nazi imagery as part of who they are. But in many cases, there are groups that use these more euphemistic names, as we talked about earlier, including some of our own defendants who use those euphemistic names, things like the Proud Boys, who consider themselves Western chauvinists. And it's so important to understand that in those cases, white supremacy is still at the core of how they operate. And what happened yesterday was at its core an attack meant to keep white men in particular and white supremacists in power and stop the steal that they think will undermine their future in this country.
All right, I have another question for you. Have other groups signed on to your suit? And this is a two-part question. Does the bankrupt strategy go beyond this suit? And then there was a thank you for your work.
Thank you. Well, our plaintiffs are the only plaintiffs in the suit. We have been really heartened to have broad support from the from so many different aspects of the country that are interested in this. So in some cases, for example, the Anti-Defamation League has formally invested in our case, which I think is fairly unprecedented for one nonprofit to support another, and speaks to the importance of this case. Other organizations like the SPLC and many, many others that I suspect many people here are engaged with have been deeply supportive of across sort of the ideological spectrum in the Jewish community and the interfaith community. One of the things that has been most heartening was on the third anniversary of the violence in August, we had hundreds and hundreds of interfaith clergy from around the country put out a public statement in support of our plaintiffs and our case, which, given how faith communities are on the front lines of this fight, from Black churches to synagogues to mosques and Sikh temples, that was so heartening. So we've been really humbled by the broad support this case has received. And I, as has been alluded to, I think also really provides a model for how to hold these groups accountable.
Okay, next question. Since some of these defendants are said to have no assets, do we know where others of their funding sources originate?
So that is a primary objective of this case. We very much want to figure that out. There's no question they had outside funding, given the vans that they used, all the equipment, et cetera. The problem is much of their funding was in Bitcoin. And it's very hard to trace Bitcoin, as you can imagine, but that is something we are very much working on. And with the new administration, we hope to have the assistance of the Department of Justice working with us, and they obviously have a lot more power to look into that than we do.
Thanks. And I have one final question, then Jamie, I'll send it back to you. What are the major arguments that the defendants are using in their defense, and what are the damages requested?
So the primary argument is, as one might expect, is the First Amendment. What they argue in kind of this sarcastic, ironic way is that you're punishing us for our beliefs, that while you may not like our beliefs, and while a lot of people don't like our beliefs, the fact that we hate Black people and Jewish people and immigrants, et cetera, is our God-given constitutional right, and you can't sue us for that. The problem with that argument is the judge has already decided in denying their motion to dismiss is that while that would be true if all they had done was speak civilly and peacefully, if they had shown up in Charlottesville, with Nazi signs and flags, just saying, as they did, Jews back into the ovens, as odious as that would be, they would absolutely have a constitutional right to do that, subject to whatever local regulations and permit regulations that they had to comply with. But that's not what they did here. What they did here is motivated by those hatreds and emboldened by those hatreds. They planned meticulously a conspiracy to commit violence. They talked about what weapons to use. They talk about how to make it look like self-defense. They talked about driving into protesters. And just like when you rob a bank, you have to talk about how to do the bank robbery. The fact that they talked about how to commit violence against minorities doesn't mean that they're protected by the First Amendment. So that's their primary defense, and that's a defense that I'm quite confident we will win throughout the case, even with this current Supreme Court, which is a very pro-First Amendment Supreme Court. I don't think any of the justices on this court will think that they have a First Amendment defense here. The second main defense that they have is kind of some combination of, we were just joking, didn't really mean it, it got out of hand, when we talked about driving over protesters, we didn't really mean that, it was just a joke. And that's really a factual defense. And on that score, we're going to have a number of experts, including Deborah Lipstadt and others, who will testify, who've studied these movements, and will testify that this kind of jokey, ironic tone is really a way for them of signaling to each other what they really intend to do. And so they may say it's joking, it may even look like joking, but there's nothing funny about any of it.
I love the use of the First Amendment as a shield when inciting violence. Not going to work.
Exactly right.
I see a lot of questions about the role of law enforcement in all of this. And I will simply say as a journalist that there's going to be, I think, a fair amount of reporting about the infiltration of law enforcement by white supremacist groups. And in fact, throughout our history, there's been that nexus between law enforcement and the Klan and white supremacist groups and sovereignty commissions. But I think there'll be a fulsome investigation of what happened yesterday in Washington. And I think we'll see additional reporting about that in the wake of the racial reckoning. I like the word reckoning. As a Black person, I'm always thinking about that reckoning, since every single day of my life I'm reckoning with race. Why isn't everybody else? I want to ask you both a final question, and it's sort of along those same lines. That, you know, I laugh a lot because if I don't laugh, I cry. I'm sure you both appreciate that. And I think many people in the audience will appreciate, along those lines, a final question. What can we do? What can we do to support you in this work? What can we do to support you in this litigation, if it's that specific, or in this moment as it seems that white supremacy is on the rise? What can each of us in this audience do? What can we do as citizens? Which of you wants to take it first? Roberta, I'll come to you first, and Amy, you can perhaps close us out and give us some words of wisdom about our role in this moment.
Look, I think the most important thing that we can do, and I'm sorry, you know, I think everyone's woken up as of yesterday, but unfortunately, over the last 4 years, the rise, the danger, the prevalence of these movements and these groups has been, I think, really under the radar far too much. I don't think people have fully appreciated the risks and the dangers. The statistics, as Amy said, speak for themselves. But there's one thing reading a bunch of numbers about deaths and crimes and not really understanding what's happening. The threat it poses to our republic, if it wasn't clear beforehand, it's certainly clear today. And I think the most important thing that people can do is bring attention to it, and two, not fall into what I would call is the trap of both sidism. You know, it is true, certainly, that when you look at the radical movements on both the far left and the far right, they often have far more in common than one would expect. But just because there are bad people on the far left, there are anti-Semites and racists on the far left, does not mean that the anti-Semites and racists on the far right do not pose a very significant risk to the future of this country and to the security of our citizens. And right now we have to fight the people who are actually killing us and who are actually committing violence on the streets. And right now, that's not Antifa right now. Antifa's not doing that. It's the groups that were at the Capitol yesterday, and it's the groups that are the defendants in our lawsuit. And so I think calling a sense of moral clarity to that distinction is very, very important.
I wholeheartedly agree. I think it's so easy to feel helpless and powerless, particularly watching something like yesterday unfold. I know I feel that way quite often, and this is my job. I haven't mentioned this in this one, but I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, and that informs so much of my own ideology, my own outlook on the world. It's really just sort of embedded in how I approach the world. And I think it's easy to make comparisons to my grandparents' generation, rightfully so, in some of the hate that we're seeing and the ideology that we're seeing. But there's also one major difference, which is that unlike my grandparents' generation, we live in a country where, well, we've had to fight like hell to defend it over the last few years. We have a justice system, we have a rule of law, we have laws like the KKK Act, and we are going to use them to fight back against rising extremism, use them to defend our democratic norms. And as hard as it has been, it is working. It's hard. It's going to involve a lot of horrible days like yesterday, probably, because this is a threat that has not been dealt with. But we can do something about it. And this case is really, I think, a perfect encapsulation of the power we have to fight back and create accountability. So there's so much that we can do as individual citizens. That's what this work at IFA and this case is about. So if you want to get involved with Integrity First for America, you can visit integrityfirstforamerica.org. You can sign up for our email list. Every dollar that we raise directly supports this case. We have an activist toolkit, a clergy toolkit. We are doing virtual workshops like this around the country. So please reach out to us if you would like to partner. But like I said, everything we are doing at IFA directly supports the Charlottesville case. So however you get engaged through lending your email and your name, your funds, if you have them, whatever it is, directly makes a big difference in this litigation. But more broadly, as Robbie said, don't let this issue fall off the radar. Don't fall prey to the both sidesism and the sort of depression that these extremists want us to fall prey to. Make sure that when the news cycle moves on from what happened yesterday, as it understandably will need to do at some point, we don't let this issue fall off our radar screens. We keep fighting. We hold our officials to account. We use litigation like ours to hold these extremists to account, and we don't let this fall back on the back burner because it's too grave of a threat to let that happen.
Well, that is the best place that we could possibly end. I want to underscore for our audience that they can find your website obviously on the invitation to this event, but I'll just say it again, integrityfirstforamerica.org. integrityfirstforamerica.org. The toolkit, the activist toolkit is there, as is all of the information about this case we've been discussing. I want to say thank you to Roberta Kaplan, Robbie Kaplan, and to Amy Spitalnik, and also to Cheryl Parker for her assist on the panel. Thanks, Cheryl, for asking those great questions. I'm sorry we could not get to all of them, but thanks for asking great questions tonight to our audience, most of all to Rabbi Joy Levitt and the Marlene Meyerson JCC Manhattan for hosting this very important conversation tonight. And most of all to all of you in the audience for leaning into it with us. I'm going to leave you with Ida B. Wells and her quote about democracy. The way to right the wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. And I say thank you to our guests for doing just that.
And thank you, Jamie.
Good night. Thank you. My pleasure and my honor.
Thank you so much.